కనిపిస్తున్నాను. యా 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 థ్యాంక్ యూ.
మేడం జగదీశ్వర్ ఇంకా చెక్ చేస్తున్నాడు మేడం, అవకాశం చెప్తాను నేను మీకు ముందు.
రైట్. There's 1 minute more. We'll wait for your friends to join in. All right. So I wanted to start punctually. Whoever is joining a little later can catch up anyway, they can see it a little later. So actually, as of yesterday, we were proceeding along with systemic anatomy, and we said we will do one system after the other, and technically we should have continued with digestive system, excretory system, reproductive system, endocrine system, integumentary system, and so on. I'm interrupting that sequence to kind of bring to you live what it is that you will be doing as soon as you come back on campus. I don't know what decision the university is going to take, but your seniors are going to finish their revisions by middle of next week, and then they will be given study leave to prepare for their exam, so they will no longer be on campus. At that time, it would be useful if you people could come onto campus and get started, because there's a whole lot of practical curriculum to cover. But I'm not sure if that policy decision is going to be taken by the university yet. Still, in preparation for you to get a sense of regional anatomy, I thought this is the last class of the week from me. So let me give you a glimpse of how we approach anatomy as the basis of surgery, which is what it is all about. You need to know the underlying structures in health with full adult maturity, so that you will be able to understand derangement and dysfunction when it happens in the patient. That is going to be the rest of your medical career. So first we need to understand normal and average structure and function. Function physiology will deal with the parameters which we call good health and optimum function. But you will know that there are individual variations in all the human activities, or in all the human possibilities. Right? There are athletes who have phenomenal prowess in muscular action and coordination. On the other hand, there may be some handicapped or differently abled people who may not have certain functions, but may have evolved a different way of using what they have, which normal people cannot do, will not have those facilities. But a differently abled person may be able to show certain actions or activities. So we can't call it normal. We don't even call it healthy, but it is definitely a potential which can be explored for the human being as an organism. So, in that whole wide spectrum of all that you can be, we are only limiting ourselves to the center of the Gaussian statistical distribution of human beings, human adults, who have a certain baseline structure which is capable of a certain baseline function. And if they are able to do that and function independently, earn their livelihood, run their lives, then we will call that good health. I'm sure they have already tried to define this for you in the community medicine classes. But as a basis of anatomy also, it's important to remember that much of medicine, much of science is averages, at least life science. Physics and chemistry is way more accurate, right? An equation is an equation. You can't budge, you can't remove one atom or one electron from the orbit. It won't make sense, or it'll become something different. Whereas life science, biology, tends to have a range of okay, which we'll accept as normal. And some individuals may go out of range at some point in their lives and still function quite adequately, right? In certain races, in certain ethnic groups, in certain geographies, or for a particular purpose, or in a certain emotional situation, certain groups of people may be capable or may show capacity to do certain things which otherwise we wouldn't consider as normal. So with that background, let's come back to the science, the biology of your parts of the body. In dissection, we usually start with a limb, an upper limb or a lower limb. That means we are starting with your appendicular skeleton rather than with your core axial skeleton. I am choosing to introduce this at this point in your medical curriculum simply as an eye opener, as a opening statement, a basis for the dissection that will come soon after. So we know that all vertebrates, terrestrial meaning those who occupy land, possess four limbs. We call them the front two are called FORE, four limbs, and the back ones are called the HIND, hind limbs. So in four-legged animals, that is quadrupeds, both the front and the back limbs are evolved. They take up body weight and they cause or they facilitate the animal to move in space. That is, they cause locomotion. But in human beings, because we've taken the weight off the front, we have stood erect, what we call the erect posture, the bipedal stance. Only two legs is what we use for standing. The whole upper limb location, geometry, spatial orientation is adapted to its new function, which is weight bearing and manipulation of things within the environment. So this completely different action, prehensile manipulative activities such as grasping, holding, picking, is going to naturally change the parameters of that limb compared to if it had been weight bearing. For example, the four most evolved primates closest to us are the gorilla, the chimpanzee, the orangutan, and the bonobo. So if you've seen the big gorillas, they take some of the weight on their knuckles. They have huge upper limbs which are used in a powerful way also to manipulate the environment, but also when they are moving, especially fast, they take some of the weight on the forelimbs. But chimpanzees and orangutans, they take the weight when they are hanging prehensile from trees, because their existence is not terrestrial so much as arboreal. So to adapt themselves best to their treetop environment, they swing themselves, that's the prehensile part, from the branches of trees. So the weight bearing is happening on the upper limb, but not so much when they are moving horizontally on the ground. So the joint, the bone, the ligament, the muscle will change. The neuromuscular coordination will change a little bit to be able to make that happen right from the babyhood of that species. So from the babyhood of our species, we are adapting to a bipedal upright stance. The whole vertebral column straightens up, right? None of our weight slouches forward. After Homo erectus, we have really straightened up our vertebral column, therefore taken the center of gravity a little more posterior, and the the vertical line of transmission of force has become almost a straight line, even though the vertebral column altogether, the vertebrae are a double curvature. The line of force, the gravity force, is going to operate almost down the axis of your skull and vertebral column right down to your sacrum. In that situation, the upper limb gets totally freed from the business, from the responsibility of bearing the weight. But anything that the upper limb holds must still, the weight of that, a bucket, a book, a bag, that weight must still be translated or transmitted, to the axial skeleton, to the midline of the body, to be able to be borne by that vertebral column, right? So the joints and the ligaments and the tendons have to be adapted in such a way that this weight-bearing transmission can take place. The girdles, what we call the shoulder girdle and the pelvic girdle, the hip girdle, will have to adjust so that the hip girdle will manage most of the weight bearing, but all the weight held by the upper limb as we manipulate the environment is also transmitted down the vertebral column to the hip girdle and then down to the feet. Alright, you'll learn this biomechanics a little bit more later, and you'll maybe learning a little bit more of it in physiology, but what you need to remember is the kind of species we are, the normal average activities that we grow up to do is what will determine the strength, the geometry, the congruence of the different components of our upper limb. So a quadruped has 4 limbs and hind limbs sharing the body weight almost equally, right? So if the dog is 30 kilos, there'll be 15 kilos in the front and 15 kilos in the back, 7.5 kilos for each leg, right? Whereas this man is 60 kilos, the entire weight is borne on his feet, ankle and feet, not at all on his forelimbs. This is the front and back aspects, the anterior and posterior views of the upper limb. So we start with the chest region because this bone is going to form a joint called the shoulder joint, which is going to be anchoring on a girdle called the pectoral girdle, which is going to be created by the clavicle and the scapula, 2 bones together forming a joint, from which this whole humerus, radius, ulna, the whole assembly is hanging from there. The whole limb has got nothing to do with the rest of your body except through the pectoral girdle, right? It hangs free, and this free mobility allows it to do things which the lower limb cannot do at all, right? And which even lower species than us cannot do so well. That much freedom has been given to the shoulder joint. But to bring that about, something had to be sacrificed, and that is stability. This is why our shoulder joint becomes more labile, more prone, more vulnerable to dislocation. It's very easy to dislocate an upper limb, easier than to break any of its bones. So the same amount of force being applied to the shoulder girdle will, the tendency, the point of weakness will be that there is not enough congruence between the head of the humerus sitting in the cavity of the scapula. It will tend to slip out. The slippage risk is higher for our upper limbs, much higher. For the lower limbs, the curvature is so much more tighter that it won't allow slippage to happen. Rather, the bone might break with the same amount of force. So we'll come to those mechanics later. This is just the anterior aspect. We see the front of the chest wall where you see the pectoral region. This is the nipple of the right side for this individual. And then you have the curve of the shoulder, you have the arm, you have the forearm, you have the wrist region and the hand with the digits. This is the back region, the scapular region. The basis of this is a triangular flat bone called the scapula. This together with the front clavicle forms the pectoral girdle, from which hangs the arm, forearm, wrist and hand. So this organ, you can call it an organ or you can call it a limb, responsible for manual activities. It is freely movable, especially the hand is adapted for grasping and manipulating the objects, consisting of a whole bunch of bones all interacting with each other at very small, very mobile synovial joints. This is a concept which will come much later. We will do it when we do dissection. But you need to remember that what we do with the most distal part of the upper limb is the final action that we do. We don't do anything independently with the upper arm or with the forearm. The upper arm and the forearm are only going to transmit the power, the weight, the location, the movement, the direction, the coordination which is required for actually doing action with the hand part. That hand has got three types of grips which I described: a power grip, a hook grip, and a precision grip. The first two are there even in our nearest primate cousins. But the precision grip, the holding of a pencil, the holding of a needle, right? The typing of your keyboard keys. This is a characteristic only in human beings and requires a great deal of neuromuscular coordination, and a lot of cortical area in your CNS has been allocated for just the tips of your fingers and a huge amount for your thumbs. We will come to that when we come to the regional dissection. To suit all this, what has happened is the clavicle has evolved as a strut which holds the whole shoulder girdle away from the whole pectoral skeleton, that is your thoracic cage, and facilitates this upper limb to move freely away from the chest wall. So whatever the chest is doing, mostly what the chest is doing is protecting the heart and lungs and allowing breathing to happen for expansion of the lungs by creating negative intrathoracic pressure by the movements of the diaphragm. That's got nothing to do with upper limb, but locationally, geographically, they are on each other. If we didn't have a clavicle, this whole upper limb would impinge on the thoracic cage, right? And that would obstruct the freedom of the upper limb to move. So the positioning of the clavicle as a horizontal bone, it's a long bone, it's a very unique bone. We will learn that. Though it's technically a long bone, you remember we did the classification of bones right in the first class. So it's a long bone just like a humerus or a radius or an ulna, but it is horizontally positioned as a something which separates or sets away the entire upper limb assembly from the chest wall. Then the shoulder joint has free mobility. The thumb is capable of a movement called opposition, which is not there in the lower limb, which is not there even in the highest primates. That's called prehension. And the rotation of this thumb by 90 degrees in the evolution of the hand, right? Instead of having the thumb at the same plane as the rest of the palm, the thumb, if you look at it under normal not in anatomical position, under normal circumstances, the thumb is at a right angle to the palm. This 90-degree rotation happened at the metacarpus bone by a provision of a different kind of joint, the first carpometacarpal joint. So this little bit of evolutionary rotation has changed what you can do with your hand by several hundred degrees. And another action which has been provided is that the two bones of your forearm can rotate on each other, bringing about what is called pronation and supination. You remember we defined these movements right in the first class when we did nomenclature. So please, for those of you who have forgotten that or didn't pay attention, this is the time to go and revise. Why I introduced this class at this point is also for you to be able to go back and check on those terminologies which may not have established themselves in your brain. Now that you're using those terminologies, you're listening and reading those terminologies in action where they're actually being applied, it's a good time to go revise those lessons if you're not with me as I'm speaking. The parts, as I already told you about, the shoulder, we saw it in the picture, the arm, also called the brachium, which is why anything of that region, the terminology is brachial artery or coracobrachialis, or words like that will come. So wherever you see the root word brachi, it means arm, upper arm region. The forearm region, also called the antebrachium, we don't use that very commonly, but the forearm region is what is supported by the radius and ulnar bones. And the hand comes after the wrist, which is a small strip of region which has many bones inside and allows for a great deal of facile movement. The hand itself will be supported by short long bones, right, having multiple joints with each other. So the shoulder region of the pectoral girdle, we said, is composed of the bones clavicle and scapula. The yellow ones, clavicle and scapula. and they are connecting this whole upper limb assembly with the axial skeleton. Already we said there's an axial and appendicular skeleton, and in the axial skeleton we said there was sternum, ribs, vertebrae, and so on and so forth. So these are belonging to the axial skeleton, and the sternoclavicular joint is where the whole upper limb assembly is going to abut on the axial skeleton. The scapula has no joint with the axial skeleton. The only joints the scapula has is one with the clavicle and one with the humerus. It doesn't have anything with the axial skeleton. It is just lying there on the back, but it is not articulating with any of the bones of the back, neither vertebrae nor ribs. It is free. It slides freely on your back. You should probably experiment. You touch your shoulder blade and then move your arm around, do all kinds of things with it. It'll glide freely. It is embedded between superficial and deep muscles, and it slides in between them. So the sternoclavicular joint is the only joint that directly articulates with the trunk. Sternoclavicular joint, important point to note. And the acromioclavicular joint, which I mentioned here, can you see the light gray area, is the joint between the acromion process of the scapula and the clavicle. So this whole bone is a clavicle, this whole bone is a scapula. This acromioclavicular joint is one more joint which belongs to this girdle. These are synovial joints. We already classified joints, remember? So this is a very mobile kind of a joint which allows a good deal of movement. This is the AC, acromioclavicular joint, which is supported by some strong fibrous structures which are called ligaments. So part of the musculoskeletal system, I didn't go into details of that, are strong fibrous bands which hold the bones together. Joints are the gaps which separate the bones, right? Ligaments are the straps which hold the bones together, which actually attach from periosteum of one bone to periosteum of the other bone and hold them together. So they're very, very important in making sure that the two bones don't fall apart while movement is taking place. Alright, so like that, there are a whole bunch of little bits and pieces of ligaments which are holding these bones together when powerful weight-bearing movements are happening with your upper limb. So for example, in the scapula, there are various parts. There's a flat triangular plate-like part. Then there was this process which we said was called acromion process. Then there was another process which is called coracoid process. It's a hook-shaped process. Now between this process and this process of the same bone, there is a ligament called the coracoacromial ligament. Similarly, between this process and the next bone, which is the clavicle, which is on the anterior side, same coracoid process but different bone, clavicle, there will be a coracoclavicular ligament, and that will have two parts, a trapezoid part and a conoid part. We'll do this in detail when we do osteology, specific bones, what are their joints, what are their ligaments, what are their muscle attachments. So we will repeat all of this. This is just to give you a sense of what are these strap-like structures called. Very easy, because they are called according to the bones which are attaching to them. So your coracoclavicular ligament is nothing but a strap of fiber which is attaching coracoid process of scapula with clavicle. The lateral part, this is the clavicle of the right side. So you have a medial end and you have a lateral end. That lateral end is forming a joint with the acromion process of the scapula, but is also forming is also connected by ligament to another process called coracoid process of scapula. This coracoid process is not having any joint with anything. It is just hanging there free. But it is having very strong ligamentous attachments which bring stability to the whole shoulder girdle complex. So the movement, the freedom of movement, the lability, the facility, the flexibility of the shoulder joint has to be supplemented by giving it strength in other ways. So it has a whole lot of ligamentous support, keeping the bones together, trying to prevent any dislocations from happening, which is why most of us will never have a dislocation. But who knows, some of you, those powerful athletes, sports persons, may be doing powerful activities with tennis or bowling or something with your shoulder joint, but it's possible that it will slip out of its socket because some ligament would have got injured or strained due to that very high power activity. Now this is one ligament. This must be a scapulohumeral, humeroscapular. Logically, we could call it that ligament. This is a coracoacromial ligament. This is a coracoclavicular ligament, the green one. So like that, there will be several ligaments provided, particularly around very, very mobile joints. So coracoclavicular ligament, same picture. And we'll come to weight transmission in a bit. So this picture is basically to show you the axial skeleton, skull vertebrae, rib cage and sternum, right up to sacrum, and the appendicular skeleton, of which in the shoulder girdle you have clavicle and scapula, and then you have the arm, forearm and hand. In the lower limb you'll have a pelvic girdle, and you'll have a leg, foreleg and foot. We will come to this later. So the pectoral girdle part is what we are looking at, and we said this whole red assembly is hanging from the whole white assembly only at this joint. It's called the sternoclavicular joint, which if you magnify it and look at it and cut through it, you'll see that the medial end of the clavicle has a joint space, and then you have the sternum which has a space, and in that there's an extra bit provided, an articular disc. You remember we said there were simple joints, there were compound joints, and there were complex joints if they had an extra material in them, right? So this would come under complex because it has an articular disc. The capsule and the ligaments have been removed just to show you that this light blue gray disc is available over here. Apart from here, between the ribs, the costa and the clavicle, there are ligaments. This is the first rib, then there'll be a second rib here, then there'll be a third rib here, and there's a fourth, and so on and so forth. So the first rib is also ending on the sternum, the clavicle is also ending on the sternum. So there is a sternoclavicular ligament, right? Then there is an interclavicular ligament. These light fibers are from this clavicle to this clavicle, bridging this notch on top of the sternum. Then there seems to be a costoclavicular ligament. So this place where so much weight bearing is going to happen is supported again by a whole bunch of ligaments. When we come to each of those joints, we will come to it in detail. I'm just introducing the terminology to you, trying to make it easy so that the logic of it fits in your head. The nomenclature is derived from what bones are attaching. So weight transmission will happen from the free upper limb via the pectoral girdle to the sternoclavicular joints, right? These ligaments, the interosseous membrane between the radius and ulna, we talked about syndesmosis, right? A strap-like fibrous connection. It is a type of joint, partially mobile, which will allow the radius and ulna to rotate on each other. The same thing exists in the lower limb between the tibia and the fibula, but it doesn't allow any movement at all because the shape of the bones interlocking with each other is very different from radius and ulna. We will come to that later. So what's happening here is weight transmission is the red lines, right? From the tips of your fingers via the radioulnar joint, this is the radius. Via the radiocarpal joint, this is the radius, and these are the carpal bones, your wrist bones. So only the radius will transmit the weight, will get the weight, because only the radius is forming a joint with the wrist bones. Ulna is not. It looks like there is, but there is no active joint, ulnocarpal joint. There is a radiocarpal joint. Then via the interosseous membrane, some weight will transmit to the ulna, and via the upper end of the humero-ulnar joint, it will transmit to humerus. From there it will transmit to scapula via the coracoclavicular ligament between scapula and clavicle, and then via the clavicle, via the sternoclavicular joint, that is the costoclavicular ligament, to the axial skeleton. Looks complicated, isn't it? It's not so much. You remember that weight transmission will not happen so much via joints as via ligaments, strong fibrous bands which are supporting the joints, right? The only place where we see it going through the joints here is the radiocarpal and the humero-ulnar joints. So those joints through which weight transmission will happen will also be more prone for dislocations, right? The weight of, let's say you're carrying a very heavy bag, this hand is carrying a very heavy bag, or is holding on to, let's say, a train door, a train which suddenly moves. So the kgf of the train moving away from you will distract the whole wrist assembly away from the radius, isn't it? Unless the whole body follows suit and jumps onto the train, and therefore the power of that distracting movement is curtailed by the whole body following the direction of the powerful movement. If it doesn't, then the dislocation can happen here, or the dislocation can happen here at the humero-ulnar joint, because that's where the bones are already separated by a synovial space. In that sense, it would be a weak place for destructive forces to act. They'll tear the supporting ligaments. The two bones will come apart. All right. Of course, the person will also fall, and there are other things also happening in real life. But I'm talking in terms of biomechanics and physics. The lines of force of weight transmission become important. We'll come to that later. That's actually more of a postgraduate topic, but I wanted to introduce this because this is living anatomy. I want you to start thinking not only of what you're going to do on your cadaver, taking them apart, but how anatomy operates in your living patient. So the force will go from hand via wrist joint to radius, via interosseous membrane to ulna, via elbow joint to humerus, via shoulder joint to scapula, particularly the coracoclavicular ligament to the clavicle, and then sternoclavicular joint and costoclavicular ligament to the axial skeleton. Alright, let's just look at a little bit at the parts of the upper limb. I won't keep you long. I'll stop at some point, and then we will continue when we actually start dissection. After this class, next week, we will continue with systemic anatomy. So, this I think my purpose was to make it easier for you to understand and grasp whatever you will read of upper limb in the introductory pages. Because otherwise, when you're reading from a book, a small textbook, there is not much explanation. There is only data. This is like this, that is like this, whatever. So I wanted to give a little bit of what shall we say, a bird's eye view of the whole limb as such, which will help you to grasp whatever it is that you read from whatever books that you're purchasing. So the shoulder region, the arm region, the forearm region, and the hand region, we already talked about that. In the shoulder region, there is a pectoral region, which is the front of the chest, the axilla, which is the armpit, and the scapular region, which is the back of the chest. In that, the bones are the front bone, which is a horizontal strut called the clavicle, and the shoulder blade, which is the scapula. And the joints which we have to look at are the sternoclavicular and the acromioclavicular. Acromioclavicular is near the tip of your shoulder. Sternoclavicular joint is at the medial end of your clavicle. In the arm, there are no subdivisions. The bone supporting it, it's one cylindrical region supported by the humerus in the center of that cylinder, and the joint there is a shoulder joint. The forearm, again, two bones, radius and ulna, supporting it, no subdivisions. There are two joints there. The elbow joint, which is the humero-radio-ulnar joint, and the radio-ulnar joint. Between the radius and ulna itself, there are three joints at the upper end, at the interosseous membrane, and at the lower end. The hand consists of three regions, like I said. It's the wrist, also called the carpus, the hand proper, which is the metacarpus, and the digits, or the fingers, which are the separated part. The hand is the singular part, which has the fleshy part is one piece. In the digits, they've been separated so that the bone is at the core and the flesh around it. Each of them is separate as 5 different units. The wrist region is supported by the carpal bones and has the wrist joint, which is the radiocarpal joint, and the intercarpal joint. There are 8 carpal bones there. They all are jointed with each other. So those are the intercarpal joints. The hand proper, or the metacarpus, is supported by your 5 short long bones, that is the metacarpal bones, and they have the carpometacarpal and the intermetacarpal joints. So between the carpus and the metacarpal, that means between the distal bones of the wrist and the base of each of the metacarpals, there will be one row of joints, right? And between first, second, third, fourth, fifth metacarpals also, at the base there may be some joints. Those are the intermetacarpal joints. The distal ends are very far from each other. They will not joint with each other. But the proximal ends are very close together. So they will joint with the wrist bones and they will joint with each other. Then you have the digits, which are the free fingers, which are supported by 3 bones in the core of it, which are called phalanges: proximal, middle, and distal phalanx. And they will have interphalangeal joints, but they will have a phalangeal with metacarpus joint, so metacarpophalangeal joint, proximal interphalangeal joint, and distal interphalangeal joints. In the shoulder region, like I said, there were 3 regions. There is the axilla, which is the armpit, which has a anterior muscle fold and a posterior muscle fold. They are called the anterior and posterior axillary folds. Now, for ladies, the fold will be only a little bit of skin and fat and a little bit of the pectoralis major muscle. In mostly in gents, and especially in anybody, women and men who do gymming, you will have very well formed and prominent axillary folds, which is good because it helps you to define the region much better, and you can get, when you palpate your patient, you'll get a lot more information. It's a good reason to keep all your muscles in good condition and do some calisthenics, some physical activity, so that all your muscles are in good defined condition. And the back, which is not there in this picture, is called the scapular region. I think we should stop here. Alright, we'll do a few more and then I'll stop. So the arm is the region between the shoulder and the elbow. That means from here to here, and it's composed of the humerus, and the end of it is the elbow joint, and it is composed of 3 joints. There are 3 bones here: humerus, radius, and ulna, isn't it? So there will be a humeroradial joint and a humeroulnar joint. Together we are calling it the elbow joint, right? Then between the radius and ulna upper ends or proximal ends, there is the superior radioulnar joint. Between the same radius and the ulna at the distal end, the lower end, there is the inferior radioulnar joint. Now, we're using superior and inferior because in anatomical position, the proximal end is superior and the distal end is inferior. Start getting used to using this terminology. Alright? Now, why so many joints? Because at each of these joints, a different facility is being provided. For example, the humeroradial humerulnar, that is equal to elbow joint, is a hinge type of joint. Remember, in synovial joints, we divided them according to the shape of the articulating surfaces. So this hinge allows only flexion and extension. But the immediate joint beneath it, that is your superior radioulnar joint. So the elbow joint line is here. Just beneath that, the radius and ulna are articulating with each other, and that allows some amount of rotation, right? That it's a variation of a ball and socket kind of joint, because there is a gripping ligament and there is a head of the radius which is rotating within it. That allows a rotatory movement, which we will translate and we will call it supination and pronation. Okay, so this superior radioulnar joint and inferior radioulnar joint, plus the interosseous membrane between these two, which is called the middle radioulnar joint, 3 radioulnar joints together bring about pronation and supination. The humerus, we will do these bones separately. It is a long bone, so we said no, diaphysis, epiphysis, proximal end, distal end, each of them has different parts. So humerus is located here, radius and ulnar located here. This I think you already know, I don't have to show you this. The forearm is the portion between the elbow region and the wrist region, composed of radius and ulna. In the distal part of the elbow joint, the upper end of the ulna is bigger. It's a big prominent part, and the upper end of the radius is comparatively a small part. But at the lower end, the radius is much expanded and much bigger, and the lower end of the ulna is much smaller. So the radius becomes dominant at the wrist and takes the entire wrist articulation. So we call it the radiocarpal joint, because at the lower end or the distal end, the radius is the one which is going to take the main articulation at the proximal part of the wrist. So this is the radius, smaller at the upper end, wider at the lower end. This is the ulna, which is wider at the upper end and smaller, or of a smaller dimension or diameter at the lower end. Between this radius and ulna, here there will be a joint, here there will be an interosseous membrane, here again there will be a joint. So 3 radioulnar joints, together bringing about this unique action called pronation and supination. It's not available in the lower limb. Though the lower limb has the same architecture, it has the same basic limb architecture, right? So in evolution from quadruped to biped stance, lot of bony architectural changes happened, some ligamentous changes happened, some neuromuscular changes also happened. Though technically the upper limb muscles are wired, neuroelectrically wired, to be able to do everything that the lower limb muscles can do, and vice versa. Evolution has caused the bones, the ligaments to become limited to only the functions that they will do. So even if muscles have been provided, they will only do what the bones can do. They can't go beyond what the bones are spatially oriented to be able to do. It's quite fascinating actually, because if we were to try surgically altering the spatial geometry of these joints with each other, technically the muscles could learn to operate those joints in slightly different ways. Technically, some amount of it is adapted in orthopedic surgery. You'll learn about that later. It's quite fascinating, where you can, in one sense, enhance what the God-given bone or joint can do by changing its geometry. We don't employ that much. The aim and the final end point of any surgical correction is to restore anatomical congruence. But in a certain few places, sometimes a modification is instituted which might enhance some functionality compared to others. We will come to that later, and your generation of surgeons will probably take that whole science forward. The hand is what discriminates you or delineates you or separates you from every other species on the planet. The Sanskrit root for it was, the Latin root is manus, which came from manush. Okay, so man, anything, manus, anything is something to do with the hand. A manuscript is something you write with your hand. So the metacarpals are the bones which are forming the hand proper. The phalanges of the fingers, the green, blue and orange, are the phalanges. Sorry, the metacarpals are the yellow ones which are forming the stuff, the substance of the hand, which are falling after the wrist area, which is formed with carpals, metacarpals, 5 of them, and phalanges, 3 in the medial digits and 2 in the lateralmost, that is your thumb digit. So we number them from lateral to medial in the upper limb, starting with the thumb, which has 2 phalanges, then the index finger, the middle finger, the ring finger and the little finger. So the phalanges of the fingers form the metacarpophalangeal joints. For in short, we say MCP. Also called the metacarpophalangeal joints are these, which we call knuckles, right? In average layperson's English, and the interphalangeal joints, which are also called knuckles. So all these together, this and this, are all called knuckles in English. But in anatomy, you have to differentiate as metacarpophalangeal, proximal interphalangeal and distal interphalangeal joints. IP is interphalangeal. Alright, this we will continue tomorrow, because the nerves which serve the upper limb, for that you have to get a sense of what are the muscle groups which will be operating all of these joints. I'll stop here. The purpose was to just introduce you to the basis of what you will do in dissection once you come back. If you have already bought your dissection manuals, which we had recommended, it's a good idea to start reading the introductory pages. If you bought Cunningham's manual, I think there are 19 or 20 pages, which is just giving you the basis of how to approach a cadaver, what to do in dissection, what it is that you will encounter, what they will look like, what is the meaning, what is the background of it. All of that will arise from the general anatomy which I have taught you so far for musculoskeletal system and nervous system, right? But especially pertaining to our upper limb and lower limb, that much is enough. But to understand body cavities and body organs, you also need to have a basis of all the other systems which we need to learn which is all your visceral organs and all your metabolic functions. And we will continue with that next week. So I'll stop here. See you on Monday. If there's anything different, or if I get to know anything about you people coming to campus, we will announce it to your student group or on the website. Thank you. Have a good weekend.